They were told to stop, not to regroup, not to wait for reinforcements, not to dig in and hold position. Just stop. The order made no sense. The enemy was retreating. The road ahead was open. Victory, real, undeniable victory, was less than a day's march away. And yet, the command came down from somewhere above, filtered through radios and runners and hastily scribbled notes, and it said the same thing every time. Told, "Do not advance." And they obeyed. It was May 24, 1940. The place was a thin stretch of farmland and canals south of Dunkirk, in northern France. The German army, specifically Army Group A under the command of General Gerd von Rundstedt, had just completed one of the most devastating military advances in modern history. In less than 2 weeks, they had shattered French and British defenses, broken through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse, and driven a wedge straight to the English Channel. The Allied forces were cut in half. The British Expeditionary Force, along with tens of thousands of French and Belgian troops, were now trapped in a rapidly shrinking pocket around the port city of Dunkirk. The German armored divisions, the panzer units that had led the charge across France, were positioned along a defensive perimeter roughly 10 to 15 miles from Dunkirk. They had momentum. They had fuel. They had the enemy cornered. All that remained was to close the distance, cut off the evacuation routes, and finish what they had started. And then, at 11:42 in the morning, the order arrived. All panzer units were to halt immediately. No further movement toward Dunkirk. No exceptions. The commanders in the field were stunned. Some thought it was a communications error. Others assumed it was temporary, a brief pause to consolidate supply lines or bring up infantry support. But the order stood, and it remained in place for nearly 3 full days. During those 3 days, over 300,000 Allied soldiers escaped across the English Channel. The halt order at Dunkirk is one of the most studied, debated, and disputed decisions of the entire war. Historians have examined it from every angle. They have read the communications logs, the war diaries, the post-war testimonies. They have interviewed survivors, analyzed tactical maps, and cross-referenced conflicting accounts from German, British, and French sources. And yet, no one can fully explain why it happened. There are theories. Many of them. Some are plausible. Some are contradictory. Some rely on fragments of evidence that point in different directions. But none of them, not a single one, provides a clear, definitive answer that accounts for every known fact. The mystery is not that the order was given. The mystery is why it was obeyed without question, why it remained in effect for so long, and why the people who gave it never agreed on what actually happened. To understand how strange this decision was, you have to understand what the German army had just accomplished. The invasion of France began on May 10, 1940. It was not supposed to work the way it did. The French military was considered one of the strongest in Europe. The Maginot Line, a massive chain of fortifications along the German-French border, was designed to make any direct invasion impossible. The Allies had more tanks than Germany. They had defensive positions. They had time to prepare. But the German plan did not rely on brute force. It relied on speed, surprise, and a gamble that most military experts considered reckless. The main thrust of the invasion came through the Ardennes forest, a region the French High Command believed was impassable for armored vehicles. It was not a frontal assault. It was a flanking maneuver on a massive scale. German panzer divisions, supported by infantry and air cover, pushed through the forest, crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, and broke into open country behind the main French defensive line. The breakthrough was catastrophic. French command structures collapsed. Communication broke down. Units that were supposed to counterattack found themselves cut off or encircled. Within days, the German armored spearheads had reached the English Channel, effectively splitting the Allied forces in two. By May 20th, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped in a pocket around the Belgian coast. Their supply lines were severed. Their only escape route was the sea. The German commanders knew this. They also knew that if they moved quickly, they could prevent the evacuation entirely. The panzer divisions were already in position. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was preparing to bomb the port facilities and any ships that tried to approach. All that was needed was a final push to close the pocket and capture or destroy the remaining Allied forces. And then came the halt order. The first indication that something unusual was happening came on the afternoon of May 23. General Heinz Guderian, one of the most aggressive and successful panzer commanders in the German army, was leading his forces toward the coast. His units were advancing rapidly. There was little organized resistance. The roads were clear. Dunkirk was within reach. That evening, Guderian received a message from Army Group A headquarters. It instructed him to slow his advance and prepare to consolidate his position. Guderian was confused, but he complied. He assumed the order was precautionary, a brief pause to allow supply lines to catch up. The next morning, May 24th, a second order arrived. This one was unambiguous. All armored units were to halt immediately. No further movement toward Dunkirk was permitted. Guderian protested. So did other panzer commanders. They sent messages back up the chain of command, asking for clarification, requesting permission to continue. The responses were consistent. The halt order stands. For the next 72 hours, German tanks sat in fields and along roadsides, engines idling, crews waiting. Some units were so close to Dunkirk that they could see the smoke rising from the burning oil depots. They could hear the artillery fire. They knew the British were preparing to evacuate. And they did nothing. On the British side, the halt was noticed almost immediately, but not understood. Officers coordinating the evacuation reported that German ground forces had stopped advancing. Reconnaissance units confirmed it. The panzer divisions that had been closing in on the perimeter were no longer moving. There were still skirmishes. There was still artillery fire. The Luftwaffe was still conducting bombing raids. But the armored assault that everyone expected, the final, crushing blow, never came. At first, British commanders assumed it was a trap, or a redeployment, or a sign that the Germans were regrouping for a larger attack. They did not believe the halt was intentional. It made no tactical sense. But the halt continued. And during those critical days, the British were able to organize what became known as Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk. Hundreds of ships, from naval destroyers to civilian fishing boats, crossed the English Channel and began pulling troops off the beaches. The evacuation was chaotic, dangerous, and costly. The Luftwaffe inflicted heavy casualties. Ships were sunk. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. But the evacuation succeeded. By June 4th, over 338,000 Allied troops had been rescued and transported to England. If the German armored divisions had continued their advance on May 24th, most historians agree that the evacuation would have been impossible. The perimeter would have collapsed. The beaches would have been overrun. The British Expeditionary Force would have been destroyed. Instead, the panzers were held back. And no one in the German High Command ever provided a clear, consistent explanation for why. The most commonly cited reason for the halt order is that it came from Adolf Hitler himself. On May 24th, Hitler was at Army Group A headquarters in Charleville, meeting with General von Rundstedt. According to several post-war accounts, it was during this meeting that the decision to halt the armored advance was made. But the details of that meeting are contradictory. Some sources claim that Rundstedt suggested the halt, and Hitler agreed. Others say that Hitler insisted on it, and Rundstedt complied. Still others suggest that the decision was a compromise, a temporary measure that was supposed to last only a few hours but was never rescinded. The reasoning attributed to Hitler varies depending on the source. One explanation is that he was concerned about the condition of the panzer divisions. They had been in constant combat for 2 weeks. Tanks had broken down. Crews were exhausted. Supply lines were stretched thin. Hitler, according to this version, wanted to preserve the armored units for the next phase of the campaign, the push south into the rest of France. This explanation is plausible. It aligns with the cautious, methodical side of Hitler's military thinking. But it does not explain why the halt lasted so long, or why infantry units were not ordered to continue the advance in place of the tanks. Another explanation is that Hitler believed the Luftwaffe could finish the job. Hermann Göring, the commander of the German Air Force, had reportedly assured Hitler that his bombers could destroy the British forces on the beaches and prevent any evacuation. Hitler, who had great confidence in Göring at the time, may have decided that an aerial assault was preferable to risking further tank losses in the marshy, canal-heavy terrain around Dunkirk. This explanation is also plausible, but it contradicts other evidence. The Luftwaffe did conduct heavy bombing raids during the evacuation, but they were not decisive. Weather conditions were poor. British fighter cover was stronger than expected, and the bombing did not prevent the evacuation. If Hitler truly believed the Luftwaffe could handle it alone, why did he not rescind the halt order when it became clear they could not? A third explanation, one that appears in several German memoirs and post-war interviews, is that Hitler wanted to leave the British a way out. According to this version, Hitler believed that destroying the British army at Dunkirk would make a negotiated peace impossible. He reportedly hoped that Britain, once its army was safely back on British soil, would agree to terms and withdraw from the war. By allowing the evacuation to proceed, he was, in effect, offering a gesture of goodwill. This explanation is the most controversial. Some historians reject it outright as post-war rationalization. Others point to statements Hitler made in private, both before and after Dunkirk, that suggest he did not want a prolonged war with Britain. But the theory has problems. If Hitler wanted to spare the British, why did he order the Luftwaffe to attack the evacuation? Why did German forces continue to shell the beaches and sink transport ships? Why did the German army resume its advance on May 27th, once the halt order was lifted, and attempt to cut off the remaining troops? The evidence does not fit neatly. Then there is the question of terrain. Several German officers, including Rundstedt himself, later claimed that the halt was a tactical necessity. The area around Dunkirk was crisscrossed with canals, rivers, and marshy ground. It was not ideal tank country. Advancing armored units into that kind of terrain risked bogging them down, exposing them to flanking attacks, and creating logistical nightmares. Rundstedt argued, in his post-war testimony, that he recommended the halt because he believed the infantry and artillery could finish the job more effectively than the tanks. This explanation is supported by some of the contemporary communications from Army Group A headquarters. There are references to concerns about the terrain. There are mentions of the need to rest and resupply the panzer divisions. But again, the explanation is incomplete. If the concern was terrain, why were infantry units not immediately ordered to press the attack? Why did the halt last for 3 full days? And why did some of the panzer commanders, men who had just led their units across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, express frustration and confusion at being told to stop? Guderian, in his memoir, described the halt order as incomprehensible. He believed the advance could have continued. He believed Dunkirk could have been taken. And he was not alone. Many of the field commanders shared his view. They were on the ground. They could see the enemy retreating. They knew the opportunity was slipping away. But the order stood. One of the most puzzling aspects of the halt order is how little documentation exists to explain it. Military organizations, especially the German Wehrmacht, kept detailed records. Orders were logged. Decisions were justified. Communications were archived. But in the case of the Dunkirk halt, the written record is strangely sparse. There is no surviving written order from Hitler explicitly commanding the halt. There are references to the decision in war diaries and communications logs, but the original directive, if one was ever put in writing, has never been found. Rundstedt's headquarters issued the halt order to the panzer divisions, but the justification given in those messages is vague. The orders cite the need for consolidation and rest, but they do not explain why the halt was so absolute, or why it remained in effect for so long. After the war, when historians and military analysts began examining the decision, they found that the German officers involved offered conflicting accounts. Some claimed the order came directly from Hitler. Others said it originated with Rundstedt. Still others suggested it was a joint decision, or that the order was misunderstood, or that it was intended to be temporary but was never properly rescinded. The lack of clarity is unusual. For a decision of such obvious importance, one that potentially altered the outcome of the war, the absence of clear documentation is difficult to explain. It is possible that records were lost or destroyed. It is possible that the decision was made verbally, in a conversation that was never formally recorded. It is possible that the people involved, once the war was over, had reasons to obscure or reinterpret what had actually happened. But these are only possibilities. The truth is that no one knows for certain. What is known is that the halt was lifted on May 27th. The panzer divisions were ordered to resume their advance. By that time, the British evacuation was already well underway. The opportunity to prevent it had passed. There is another layer to the mystery, one that is rarely discussed in popular accounts of Dunkirk. The halt order was not universally obeyed in the way it was intended. Some units interpreted the order narrowly. They stopped their advance but continued to engage in reconnaissance, artillery fire, and local skirmishes. Others took the order literally and ceased all offensive operations. This inconsistency created confusion on the battlefield. In some sectors, German forces continued to press forward. In others, they pulled back or held their ground. The result was a patchwork of activity that did not align with any clear strategic plan. British and French forces, observing this uneven behavior, were unsure how to respond. Some units prepared for an imminent assault. Others took advantage of the lull to organize defensive positions or withdraw toward Dunkirk. The lack of coordination on the German side is difficult to explain if the halt order was meant to be a coherent strategic decision. It suggests either miscommunication, ambiguity in the order itself, or disagreement among the German commanders about how seriously to take it. There are accounts from German soldiers who were present during the halt, letters, diaries, and post-war interviews that describe a sense of frustration and bewilderment. One tank commander wrote in his diary that his unit had been on the verge of cutting off a British column when the halt order arrived. He described his men as angry and confused. They could see the enemy retreating. They could not understand why they were being told to stop. Another account, from an infantry officer, describes receiving the halt order and assuming it was a mistake. He sent a runner back to headquarters to confirm. The response came back. The order was correct. Hold position. These individual accounts do not provide answers, but they do suggest that the halt was not part of a well-understood, widely communicated plan. It was, at the level of the troops on the ground, an order that did not make sense. And yet, it was followed. In the years immediately after the war, the Dunkirk halt became a subject of intense scrutiny. British historians, understandably, wanted to know why the German army had stopped. The evacuation of Dunkirk had been portrayed as a miracle, a desperate, last-minute rescue that saved the core of the British military and allowed Britain to continue the war. If the Germans had pressed their advantage, the outcome could have been catastrophic. German officers, many of whom were interviewed or wrote memoirs, offered a variety of explanations, but few of them agreed. Rundstedt maintained that the halt was a sound tactical decision based on the terrain and the condition of the armored units. He denied that it was a mistake. Guderian and other panzer commanders disagreed. They believed the halt was a strategic blunder, one that allowed the British to escape when they should have been destroyed. Hitler, in his later statements, offered conflicting accounts. At times, he blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to prevent the evacuation. At other times, he suggested that the British escape had been inevitable. He never fully took responsibility for the halt order, nor did he clearly explain his reasoning. Göring, for his part, claimed that the Luftwaffe had done everything possible, but that weather and British air defenses had interfered. The post-war testimony is a tangle of contradictions, evasions, and self-justifications. Everyone involved had a reason to shift blame or reinterpret events in a way that made them look less responsible. What emerges from this tangle is not a clear picture, but a deepening sense that no one, not even the people who were there, fully understood what had happened or why. There is a question that rarely gets asked, but perhaps should be. What if the halt order was not a single decision, but a series of smaller decisions, miscommunications, and assumptions that compounded into something no one intended? What if Rundstedt suggested a brief pause and Hitler agreed, but neither of them communicated clearly how long the pause should last? What if the order was passed down through multiple levels of command, and at each level, it was interpreted slightly differently? What if the Panzer commanders, exhausted and operating in a fog of incomplete information, assumed the halt was temporary and did not push back hard enough? What if the Luftwaffe's assurances gave Hitler and Rundstedt false confidence that the evacuation could be stopped from the air, and by the time it became clear that it could not, too much time had passed? This version of events does not involve a single dramatic decision or a moment of clarity. It involves uncertainty, miscommunication, and a series of small hesitations that added up to something larger. It is less satisfying than a clear explanation, but it may be closer to the truth. Military decisions are not always made with perfect information or clear logic. They are made by people under stress, operating with incomplete intelligence, influenced by fatigue, ego, politics, and the limitations of communication technology. The Dunkirk halt may have been the result of all of these factors converging at the wrong moment. Or it may have been something else entirely. One possibility that has been raised, though it remains speculative, is that the halt was influenced by political considerations that had nothing to do with battlefield tactics. By late May 1940, Germany had already achieved stunning victories. France was collapsing. The British were in retreat. From a strategic perspective, the war in the West was essentially won. But Hitler was already thinking ahead. He knew that a prolonged war with Britain was not in Germany's interest. He knew that the Soviet Union, to the east, represented a future threat. He may have believed that crushing the British army at Dunkirk would make a negotiated peace impossible, that it would force Britain to fight to the bitter end rather than seeking terms. If this was his reasoning, then the halt order was not a military decision. It was a political one. But there is no direct evidence to support this. No document, no statement, no conversation that was recorded or reliably reported. It is a theory, one of many, and like all the other theories, it explains some of the evidence but not all of it. The British, for their part, did not waste time analyzing the halt while it was happening. They took advantage of it. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, was organized with remarkable speed and improvisation. Naval officers, civilian boat owners, and volunteer crews worked around the clock to ferry troops across the channel. The operation was dangerous, chaotic, and incomplete. Thousands of soldiers were left behind. Equipment was abandoned. Ships were sunk. But the fact that it happened at all, that over 300,000 men were rescued, was due in large part to the 3-day window created by the German halt. British commanders, in their post-war accounts, expressed surprise at the halt. Some acknowledged that they had expected a final armored assault that never came. Others suggested that the Germans had underestimated the difficulty of the evacuation and overestimated the effectiveness of their air attacks. But none of them claimed to understand why the halt had occurred. To them, it was simply a stroke of luck, or providence, or miscalculation on the part of the enemy. They did not have the answers either. One of the reasons the Dunkirk halt remains unresolved is that the key decision-makers, Hitler, Rundstedt, Göring, and others, are long dead. The people who might have been able to clarify what actually happened and why took their knowledge with them. What remains are fragments. Documents that suggest one thing but not another. Testimonies that contradict each other. Orders that were followed but never fully explained. Historians have done their best to piece it together. They have examined the evidence from every angle. They have proposed theories, debated interpretations, and filled in gaps with educated guesses. But in the end, the Dunkirk halt is still a mystery. It is a moment where the record goes silent, where decisions were made, but the reasoning behind them was never clearly documented, where orders were given and obeyed even though they seemed to contradict everything that military logic would suggest, and where the outcome, an evacuation that should have been impossible, became one of the most famous episodes of the entire war. The halt order at Dunkirk is not the only example of an unexplained decision during World War II. There are others. Moments where armies stopped when they should have advanced. Moments where commanders made choices that, in hindsight, seem inexplicable. But Dunkirk is perhaps the most famous, and the most studied, and still, after more than 80 years, no one can say with certainty why it happened. The tanks sat in the fields. The orders stood. The evacuation proceeded. And the silence that followed was never fully broken.